Hello and welcome to Das Nostalgia Podcast, episode 28. As usual, I'm your host, Anatoly, and today, for your listening pleasure in my virtual studio, with us is a very special guest. Sir, please introduce yourself.
What's up, Anatoly? My name is Dan Policar, and I'm a musician slash retro nerd, and I think that's why we get along so well. Because we can talk nerd stuff all day and all night, which is, that's kind of my thing. I don't know.
That's what we're going to be doing here, hopefully.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, not all day and all night, but for a limited amount of time. But before we get to the topic, let me ask you if you remember the first time, your first encounter with an IBM PC or a clone.
Yes. Now, which exact PC model it was, I can't tell you. But my uncle, who lives in the state of Washington, which is where I'm from, Seattle area, my uncle introduced it to me, specifically games. He introduced me to a game for DOS called Round 42, which is, I guess you'd call it a Space Invaders clone of some kind. And written by a guy named Mike Pooler, who I later read some articles on the internet that were not too favorable about him. Apparently he kind of, before Kickstarter was popular, ran some campaign, and who knows if he actually took a lot of people's money or if he just tried to develop something and it didn't work out. But anyway, I think that was really his only game, or his only known game. And I mean, you'd be the guy to ask that question, but I don't think he has any other games of note if they were completed. But that game was really good, and my uncle gave me a certificate, which my mother found in a book, and it says that I completed round 42, and he gave me like a certificate. He put the date on it, and I remember posting it to our big box guys chat, our big box PC game collectors chat, and Jim Leonard asked me if it was real. I said, well, it's very real. My uncle made it on his computer and gave it to me, but it's very real. There was no actual certificate given out because the game was freeware. So I don't think the guy made a penny off that game. It was impressive for the time. I mean, I don't know that the sound was, top notch or anything, but I enjoyed it. And that was the first time I remember playing computer video games. I don't know if I was playing NES before that, but that's the first time I remember strong PC gaming.
Wow, that's cool. That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
and pretty specific. Pretty early on too.
Yeah. Now the question is, was I playing that game that year? I think so. Wow. And the weird thing is, like, I don't really have necessarily a good memory of things not music or not video games, but I have a lot of specific memories of where I played certain games, and then kind of the pursuit of them over the years. Playing the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade for the first time, the adventure game, not the action game. Playing that for the first time, I think it probably might have even been the demo, and then acquiring a copy of it for myself, or my family acquired a copy of it, and it was the pack-in copy. My neighbor, for some reason, had a stack of those envelope versions of the game.
Yes, I saw that at an expo for the first time, like two years ago. Somebody had actually Last Crusade in a brown envelope. Yeah,
it's like an envelope, half-size kind of big box envelope thing, and it had the Grail Diary, and I remember carrying the Grail Diary around with me as I moved rooms at my parents' house when I was a kid, and carrying the Grail Diary with me for some reason. I don't know. I just did.
It's a great piece of like pack-in, whatever we call them,
like a feely.
Yeah.
Booklet, whatever. It's
but
awesome.
It's really well made.
I think that's really well made, and the game was really well made.
The game,
I mean, obviously,
for a licensed game, it has it's probably better than it has any right to be. Yes, it's a LucasArts game, but they were restricted by that movie,
Right.
but yet it
Sure.
takes quite a lot of liberties with that story, and also manages to pull off some interesting design choices.
Yeah, like there was an action arcade combat sequence. I mean, not a lot of those
And everything,
LucasArts had those,
you
right?
could actually you didn't have to follow the story exactly. You could actually change certain things. You could
Sure.
find a slightly different approach to the same situations,
Yeah,
which was
but you
nice.
still had to break your dad out and find the
Right.
funny thing was there was a dead end in this game. There was a
Yes,
dead man
and you could
walking.
die. Yeah.
Yeah, but there wasn't. I thought LucasArts generally were known for not having dead man walking syndrome, and this was a big dead man walking. Like if you didn't get the picture, well, let's not put spoilers in there, but if you didn't do something in the castle before you left it, you were screwed. Even you could advance to the very end of the game, and then you essentially had to just guess.
Well, I mean, Zach McCracken is where that philosophy first debuted in print. You know, the famous LucasArts design philosophy
Was that their first one?
it's the first one where
Or
that
was that Maniac Mansion was the first one?
Maniac Mansion was the first one, but with Zach McCracken, the text of that philosophy was included for the first time, and Zach McCracken is full of dead ends.
Yeah, I like that game too.
I'm
I
not.
like that
I'm
game a lot.
not a big fan.
Really?
I think it's
Oh,
a
man.
cool concept, but I'm not a fan of it. But whatever. We're not here to talk about Zach McCracken. I mean, I've recorded a whole bunch of podcasts about computer sound throughout the years and everything, but I guess I would never was as specific as we're going to get today, because we're here today to talk about a revered device, retro vintage PC sound device called the Roland MT-32, the mythical, legendary, but also very real device that both of us own. We should point that out right before we start, that we know what we're talking about. It's not just off the Wikipedia article. We both
Well, Anatoly knows what he's talking about. And I'm here.
not really, but so Roland MT-32. Let's start from the beginning, right? So the year 1987 seems to be the seminal year for sound devices for the IBM PC. Before that year, PC speaker, mainly business machine, only got around with its built-in beeper that really wasn't made for much.
Beeper, buzzer. There's a bunch of names that I never realized. I always referred to it as PC speaker
it's
because
PC
that's what it told me
speaker
on the screen.
but it was designed to give you a beep on the boot up and give you different sort of beeps if there were errors, and you would know. It's literally just one tone. I mean, over the years, people managed to squeeze out a little bit more out of it, but it wasn't the best device for sound, especially considering sound on other 8-bit micros and personal computers around that time. PC was definitely on the very low end of that
No
aspect.
doubt, they were at the lowest end.
They were at the lowest end, unless, well, there were also some micros without any sound. So I guess
Yeah, well, initially my I remember. Well, I guess no. I always remember having at least a PC speaker, but eventually, um, eventually, I had to buy my first sound card. I had to buy. Like I had to buy it. My parents wouldn't buy it.
What was your first sound card?
Well, I don't know the name of it, but I can tell you what it was. I bought it in a package from Radio Shack.
Okay.
I think it was 75 or 85 bucks of my own money, which is still a ton to me today.
Okay.
And back then it was really a ton.
Mm-hmm.
And it came with a set of speakers.
Okay.
Unpowered, of course. They just plugged into the back of the sound card. The sound card was analog. I remember that because it had the volume dial on the back, which was very annoying to reach to the back of the machine to turn up the volume and up and down. And it also came with a joystick, which was awful, but I used it a lot because I didn't have anything else. What was it called? I have no idea. I just know it was a Radio Shack bundle that I remember being in a light blue box.
But was it Sound Blaster compatible?
It was definitely Sound Blaster compatible. It was 8-bit too, I believe. Mm-hmm. I don't believe it was 16-bit, but I remember I was running it on a 386 SX. I want to say it was an SX 2025 Packard Bell. Mm-hmm. And it just didn't, it worked with everything. I remember it remember playing games with, but it didn't sound particularly flattering.
Well,
Eventually, I got what's-a-name running on it.
If it's the Sound Blaster compatible, so it had the OPL2 on it as well.
Well, was it a real OPL2? Who knows?
I mean, at the time, it probably was, because
they didn't have clones.
They didn't have clones yet. Yeah.
Is it because they weren't allowed to? It was a license thing.
I also think it's because OPL2s were really cheap and you could just buy them.
Gotcha. Now, quickly, 1987, right? I quickly looked up to see what the best, quote unquote, best-selling computer of 1987 was, and the number I came up with, I think, is actually wrong. It said 6 million Commodore
64,
Amiga 500s were sold in 87.
Which I don't think is right. It's in between 87 and 92.
Yeah, that's what I think it is. The whole life of the Commodore Amiga 500.
Well,
right?
The 500, yes.
Yeah. So, but it was introduced. The 500 was introduced in 87.
Yes, I believe so, or 88.
The 1000 was 1000. Well, from what I read, it was 87.
Yeah, that sounds about right. A couple of years after.
1000 was introduced in
85.
And actually, the Amiga 1000 was my first experience with unbelievable computer music sound. That was, phenomenal for the time. And interestingly enough, that computer and the MT-32, I guess, at some point, developers, software developers, hardware developers saw that the PC was going to eventually overtake all the rest of the other companies. I don't know how, because Commodore was a giant for that period of time, right? Or were they starting to die by 87? I'm not sure.
Well, the thing is, not quite yet, but at that time, computers started picking up to the point where nobody expected them to be, just by the nature of clones. Right? It was an open design. In fact, even 87 was the year when IBM was like, oh shit, open design is hurting us, because we are starting to be known as overpriced, but not quite as good, because everybody's making clones. And they introduced their microchannel standard, which never went anywhere, because the strength of PCs is in its open architecture. So nobody was gonna buy a proprietary closed architecture, their PS2 line. But,
you mean like an Apple?
Well, yeah,
because there were no clones of an Apple.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you were an Apple, which was at the time with like 2%, whatever. Well, no, at that point probably a bit larger market share. But either way, it turned out that IBM, the IBM compatibles, not IBM itself as a company, won by the nature of being open and expandable, and easily clonable. Which is why the clones flooded the market, and by 87 it was very apparent that they were here to stay.
It's a very socialist perspective, but I agree.
And they were also very, you wouldn't use an Amiga or a Commodore 64 in an office to type up documents and stuff. IBM PC was
definitely a home machine.
The IBM PCs were the machine for work. Not great in graphics, terrible sound. Well, no sound, really, mostly. But they could do, on decent monitors, could have high resolutions for text modes and fast processors, lots of RAM, lots of storage, easy storage to maintain. So, and that's how IBM PC eventually won the platform wars, and it was super expandable. I mean, like, look at an Amiga or whatever. Amigas became sort of expandable, not the 500 for sure, but
the 1200, for sure.
But all other machines were sort of standard configurations, more or less, where IBM PC sort of out of the box, it was just meant to be expandable, which is also the reason, let's say, an Apple II lasted as long as it did, because it was the machine for enthusiasts, and it was meant to be, messed around with. It had tons of expansion slots and everything.
Right.
So we're now derailing like 15 minutes past anything we wanted to talk about. So 1987 seems to be like the watershed year for audio on PC, because a lot of devices launched that year. Like the IBM PC, IBM itself launches the feature music card.
What's that? I don't know about that.
Nobody knows about it because now they're like tens of thousands of dollars and nobody bought them because we're also like it's also its own synthesizer on a board. It's very interesting, pretty good sound, but it was because it was an IBM product from 1987. It also cost just as much as an MT-32. Yeah, I think maybe like $100 less. So nobody bought it.
Well, you know what's interesting too about the Roland or some of these old devices, like a lot of people look on the companies that were around back then with like great, I mean, it's nostalgia and rose-colored glasses and all these things, but they look on them with great affection like they're dead companies. Roland is anything but a dead company.
Oh, yeah.
Yamaha too. But I don't think a lot of people know that Roland is like a big synthesizer company still. Like there's only really there's more than three, but there's three main ones.
The three main ones are Roland, Yamaha, and Korg.
The other one. Yep.
So yeah, but either way, so like music feature card, right? Creative launches the Creative Music System, aka the Game Blaster. AdLib launches AdLib Music Synthesizer.
Wow.
Parallel, not in the same league, but also Kovacs happens.
So, but the Kovacs was digital audio.
Yeah, that's
only,
not unrelated.
But no synth.
But it was also in the same, in the same year for PC, and even a couple of others that nobody even remembers at the time. But another one of those was Roland MT-32, which admittedly had nothing to do with computers.
It
originally.
wasn't supposed to, right?
It wasn't supposed to. The thing that Roland MT-32 is and that name stands for multi-timbre sound module. It's a lower end synthesizer.
Yep.
So it's a full synthesizer machine, originally produced to sort of be like a lower cost solution for a sort of prosumer user, I guess. It's actually quite capable. So it has like a library of 128 synth sound. Right. You could play multiple channels depending on which instrument you pick. It would take up to several channels, but I guess if you sort of combine the things, like up to 8 channels, melodic channels at once, and 1 rhythm channel.
And I think there was a hack. Somebody told me about a hack to be able to get another rhythm channel or something like that.
Well, who knows? And we'll get to exploits later. Yeah. It had all kinds of fancy things like reverb and stuff.
Well, it only had reverb and chorus, right? I don't think there was any other effects.
But again,
but you could dial in how much of that you
exactly and again, it was 1987, so
right.
And
well, that was a big deal because I don't know how much we want to talk about the beginning of digital synthesizers, but up until a certain point in the 80s they were all analog synthesizers, which means they did all kind of crazy things. Like they would go out of tune. You have to tune. If you own a Moog from back in the day, you have to tune it,
right? Like
still you have to tune it,
right?
And if you buy a new one, they make them now, you still have to tune analog synthesizers. They don't just automatically tune themselves. So like you're talking about a lot of things kind of put into a really small box in the MT-32. Now, as a musician, the MT-32 is really odd because what it contained was really cool. The sounds were amazing. The for the time, and the form factor was nice and small. The problem was it was not rack mountable, and rack mount is something that every music studio owner would have and use. And even worse, it was like there was no way to program it on the unit itself.
That's another thing. So they cut out the cost was cut out by the fact that the unit just had a little bit of a dial that lets you adjust certain parameters in the things, but it's just switching things like on, off, and adjust the levels, and you can do it in groups or individually, but that's really it. It has like a little LCD screen and stuff. But so big synthesizer, real synthesizer like a Roland D50, which is its direct predecessor in a sense, or not the predecessor so much
as
it's
like the father.
The father, yeah.
Right?
It just I don't even know, like probably several $1,000, $2,000-$3,000 at the time.
Between $2,000 and $3,000.
So at the time, on introductory price of Roland MT-32 was $695, which is a lot.
Yeah,
which is the reason why they were so rare. But
That's probably still about $2,000 in today's dollars,
it's
right?
a lot of money. Yes, yeah. It's still a lot of money. Like $700 was a lot back then, and it's sure is a lot now.
Yep.
So what it did have, it had something called linear arithmetic synthesis, which is partially subtractive synthesis, I guess. But the cool thing, and again, keep in mind it's 1987, how it produced the sound. It had a tiny little bit of a that part is digital. It has a little. It has a bank of sounds, which are samples. They're very short, and they're
the music guys call that a rompler now.
And so when you generate the sound, sound doesn't just happen. It just sort of needs to appear, like you press on the key or something. It's not just a straight waveform. So to generate that part of the sound that's called an attack, that's a digital sample. But then the rest of that sound is generated partially in analog, actually, which is why we couldn't emulate it for so long, because the digital part is easy. Like you would get Munt with the most advanced MT-32 emulator currently from like 5 years ago, and it still wouldn't sound like an MT-32. These days it's pretty close, but it's hard to nail down the rest of it.
No, these days I think it's, in a lot of ways, it's quote unquote better.
It's better because it doesn't have any of the flaws.
You don't have any noise that you would have with an actual unit.
Even 5 years ago, in the year 2015, Munt was far from perfect.
Sure. I only recently was introduced to Munt. And to be honest, only recently was introduced to the MT-32. I didn't even know
we're not going to say that. We're going to cut this part out. You're a pro. You're a pro. No, I'm just
kidding. Doesn't matter. I never used it. I had a ton of other Roland keyboards, but I never touched that one. I have a Roland V-Synth GT that I play in my rig currently on tour. But yeah, the MT-32, dude, I only know about it for a couple, but I knew about it from looking in my sound.
Everybody knew about it because everybody wanted it, right? When they were kids.
I didn't know what it was.
In a thing, but you did see the
selection, right? I knew it was an external
right?
unit. Yes. But that's about it. I was like, okay, what's this? What's this LAPC 1?
Oh yeah, that's
CM32L.
And you look at the price and you're like, well, I'll never have that.
I don't even think I ever got that far. I was just trying to make music with whatever I had.
Exactly. So it's a very interesting device, but like as we mentioned before, you couldn't program it. The most important part of a synthesizer is being able
not from the unit. Yeah.
You couldn't program it from the unit. So for that, well, not for that specific reason, but Roland also offered a unit called MPU 401, and MPU 401, which literally stood for Music Programming Unit, and they actually launched that before MT-32 because all those standalone Roland units were able to connect. It has a regular MIDI interface, right? So in order to program the unit from a computer, you needed to get an MPU 401, which would take the input from the computer and pass it along to the synthesizer. But MPU 401 is also a standalone unit that's really not tailored to any computer. So you would need to get an appropriate card for your machine to get the output from the actual computer to the MPU.
You're trying to tell me that none of this came with the MT-32 when you
not
bought
originally,
it, right?
not in 1987. In 1988, yes, but not in 1987. So those are all standalone things, and Roland actually produced a whole bunch of those cards that you could connect your computer, whatever computer you had, because they were all incompatible, to the MPU 401 and output your MIDI commands too, and then MPU 401 would take those computer commands, convert them to MIDI commands, and send them out to a synthesizer. And the cards and cartridges for different computers are varied. They are for like Apple II, for C64, for IBM PC, for MSX, for one like NEC and Sharp. They had all those things that were able to connect to MPU 401, and each one of those. So the card, an MPU 401, an MT-32, those were all separate products that you had to buy separately, all with their own cost.
And you literally couldn't use, well, I guess because, as you said, originally the intent was for the MT-32 to be used by musicians. So
right. So if you had a musician would have a way to, well, you could just plug in your synthesizer into it.
I would plug directly into it and just play it right from there.
You would just play it from there. So you would need an MPU 401 because but serendipitously,
and even to program it, I could run from an outboard sequencer.
Exactly. So if you
yeah.
were a musician, those things would be available to you. But the musical community sort of ended up rejecting it because it just wasn't good enough.
Well, I could sequence on it, but I couldn't actually change and program the synthesizer sounds on it.
Well, that's
without software.
So that's another thing. MPU for one allowed you to change the presets,
right,
and upload your things, which is what makes it really interesting. Because we sort of gave up on that later on as another MIDI standard got introduced. But so
it was almost immediately introduced as the new standard, and that is still used today. Like, general MIDI is what.
By the way, we should say, for people who are not musicians and who are retro PC enthusiasts, I often hear, especially in the retro gaming community, MIDI as being referred to, MIDI being used as a style of music. MIDI is not a style of music. MIDI, in fact, is a protocol.
It's simply data.
It's a protocol of transferring data
zero sound by itself
to a device. MIDI is very started in the early 80s, but the standard 1982 I guess it was launched, and in 1992 when the big change happened to general MIDI, and we use that standard today. Like every time you buy a pedal or
I lied, sorry, 1983.
Okay, who cares? Long time ago. But every time you buy one of those devices, one of the pads or pedals or anything to plug into other thing, in the musical thing, it's done with a MIDI interface, and it uses MIDI interface, uses that protocol to send data in. And of course, on computers we also have MIDI container files, those files that contain those commands to play music. But
a MIDI file, you're saying?
Yes. But they just contain data. They don't contain anything like any sounds by themselves. But either way, it's
I hear that all the time. Like you said, somebody said, "Oh, it's MIDI music." I'm like, well, okay. I mean, I'm still using MIDI music to program current music.
Yeah, like, MIDI music. MIDI means nothing.
EDM is still using MIDI.
Yeah, it's the same. Listen, it's just a thing of passing data. It's no different than plugging a power cable in. Like, it's all electric, but it's not what makes the music.
Right.
So
it's the synthesizer chips and the digital audio converters that allow us to hear that information translated into music.
Right, which is also why MIDI is nothing concrete. Like when you say something is MIDI, you're not really describing anything. Like you have
you're just saying it's the interface.
You have to point to what's actually making the sound for it to make sense. So the unit wasn't studio friendly. And it was also noisy because of how it was built. So
it was a cheap digital audio converter, which is kind of, sadly, that's kind of what everybody knows about their sound cards. We're really, like, even a sound card nowadays, it's still not a very good digital to audio converter. Like, you really want an outboard DAC, as they're called. Or an interface of some kind as opposed to a sound card. But that's a whole nother discussion for another time. If you want really clean sound, the interface is the way to go. And
if you want a really clear sound, you won't find it on your Realtek built in on the motherboard thing.
No, generally not.
But either way, so it sort of didn't find the use in the field that it was primarily targeted with. But just serendipitously, because it was a standalone unit, small, somewhat accessible, and it also had all those peripherals that allowed it to be connected to a computer, it found its niche in the PC sound, mostly because Sierra at the time was picking up a whole bunch of popularity, and they always were pushing for like better technology and everything. So when the device launched in '87, they approached Roland to be their official distributor for a bundle. Now, I assume with the I don't know, I couldn't find the data actually, but we know that the original launch price of MT-32 in 1987 was $695, right? $700. I couldn't find how much how much MPU 401 was at the time, or how much the MIF IPC, which would the card for the IBM PC was. But I assume altogether it probably cost you at least $1,500, right? Like, or $1,200 thereabouts. A lot. It was a lot of money. But Sierra offered some kind of a deal. I don't know if it was just the markup was giant or whatever, but somehow they managed to work out a deal where they were allowed to be the official distributor of that thing in a bundle, and the bundle gave you all three for a low price of $550.
That's not bad. That's a lot better.
By 1988, they advertised it in all of their internal magazines and other computer magazines, and they even recorded the tape, which you can now listen to on YouTube.
Oh yeah, I did listen. I think you sent me a recording of that tape.
It's a cassette tape that just shows you different audio devices, and MT-32 of course sounds miles ahead of anything else. But in 1988, of course, King's Quest 4, the SCI version, the better version of King's Quest 4, was the first game to support an MT-32, and all the games. Basically, for the rest of the 80s, all Sierra games really lean heavily into MT-32 sound and really use its capability. Like Sierra would take big advantage of that whole programming thing where you could change the sounds, and all of the Sierra games are usually very like custom patch heavy. They take forever to load too if you have like an old MT-32. Because it takes a bit to send the changes.
Well, the other cool thing is like the famous Space Quest 3, right? The insert Buckazoid.
Well, and they also had custom messages for everything, for every game.
So, well, explain that, because people can't really see it. Like custom messages, there's an LCD screen on the unit.
Yes.
And that displays, the sound name and this and that and the other, the reverb, whatever.
It can display a lot of things.
If you're playing a game, if you're playing Space Quest 3, for example, at the beginning of the game, it'll say insert Buckazoid, which is, really cool. You had to have gotten a kick out of something like that. Let's say whenever you put that disc in, you play the game and you see the message pop up. Oh my God, what's that? Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah,
it's talking to the outboard unit. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's really cute. I mean, it's nothing.
That's a good way to describe it.
It's really cool, and they use that because it sends a command first to change the thing, so you would have time to look at it, and then it sends all the patches, because sending the patches took a long time back in the day, so it would hang there for like.
Right, it has to send what's called a system exclusive message, which is it's a way of sending. MIDI information exclusive to the MT-30, non-general,
non-music command. It would adjust the parameters, and because often games would adjust so many, and on the original MT-32, which is what I have, there has to be at least a 40 millisecond delay between each one of those.
Right.
That sort of combines. It takes like sometimes good like 20 seconds to. Well, maybe not 20 seconds, I don't know, but it seems to sit there for a bit. So you would have at least a nice message to look at while you were loading. But Sierra really took advantage of MT-32. I mean, every score on a like 80s Sierra SCI game is really good. Some of my favorites are, I guess, well, Leisure Suit Larry theme sounds great, because it's a very sort of like jazzy kind of thing.
Well, and why is that? Why is it a jazzy thing? Any ideas?
Because Al Lowe plays a saxophone and he's a funny guy.
Right. He's a jazz saxophonist, and he was a school teacher, I think, before that.
Yes, which is pretty funny. But
he was also one of the main guys.
He's also a dirty old man. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, but he's known for that game. But he worked on a lot of stuff.
Well, let's face it, he got his start with the Disney games. So,
yeah, that's what I remember about him.
Which didn't have any sound, but.
Didn't they have any sound at all?
Oh, well, if they did, it was like beeps and boops.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I played Donald Duck's Playground on Amiga. I remember.
Oh, that had sound, but that's a bit later. I'm thinking of the
Mickey Mouse one,
the Winnie the Pooh, the ones that he did on his own, like the Apple II ones. Yeah.
Stuff. Yes.
So, but either way, what do I say? Leisure Suit Larry theme sounds great. The Quest for Glory soundtrack is amazing. The first game.
Yeah.
I love the Colonel's Bequest. That has a really cool sort of 1920s.
There's a lot of ragtime,
yes,
Scott Joplin tunes in that soundtrack.
Yeah, it's like if you unpack the resources, like 3 of them are like the entertainer, like literally. It just all kinds of cool soundtrack. Police Quest 2 has like a really cool
Space Quest 3? No mention?
Space Quest 3. Yes, I'm just so used to the ad-lib version of that I don't think about it first. But yes, on MT-32 it sounds magical, especially like not even the intro, like when you first get in a trash compactor, or like
and you get out of the
you walk
get out of
around
the spaceship. Yeah,
and of course at the time MT-32 wasn't the only device to support stereo, but of those launched in 1987. But out of the two you were more likely to have, the other one was AdLib, which was not stereo compatible. It's mono. Just have all of this like beautiful sound in stereo. It was quite magical. In fact, it probably, like, I think the effect of how, the EGA graphics and everything, that has aged a bit, but that music still kind of, it sounds pretty good even today.
Well, if you're talking about EGA and MT-32, I would be silly not to mention that currently something I'm working on with a Canadian developer, game developer named Julia Minamata. She is working on a game called The Crimson Diamond, which is actually based exactly off what we're talking about. 1988 EGA text parser, and I'm helping her with the soundtrack because I know almost zero about computer programming and game programming, but I'm working all off the MT-32. So all the music for that game will be done on the MT-32, problems and all.
Yeah.
Will you be able to play it on your own MT-32? No. Not at this point anyway, because it's going to be too much to implement, but all the music will be 100% MT-32.
So I named a couple of my favorite Sierra. Well, I guess we've named a few Sierra soundtracks from the 80s. What other like 80s MT-32 soundtracks you're fond of?
I'm trying to remember some that were non-Sierra.
I mean, at the time every big game started supporting it. Like
right, but then the interesting thing was, so as games started to support it and keep the support there, the SC55 and General MIDI standard were introduced the next year or 2 years later?
A few. So the standard was introduced, I think, in 91, and
91.
and SC55 and everything support basically started going in 92. But we have a good solid 4 years in between the two. So another one, I usually put like which ones I like all the Electronic Arts games had pretty cool MT-32 soundtracks. One of my favorite is Budokan, the Martial Spirit. Has an amazing intro tune.
I think I have a Commodore version of that.
F-29 Retaliator.
Oh, I never played that one.
That's the only flight sim I can play. It has really, really cool thing. It Came from the Desert. I don't know, even like crappy games like Capstone's Miami Vice is a crappy game but has a nice intro.
Well, I have a copy of TIE Fighter right in front of me, and I'm looking at the box, and check this out. I always like using the utility in this program to test older PCs hardware because it has, sound-wise, it has almost every option. Sound Blaster, Sound Blaster Pro, Sound Blaster 16, AW32, which is also compatible with AW64 or AWE, whatever you want to call it, Pro Audio Spectrum, and Roland MT-32, LAPC1, and General MIDI. And
but that's a bit of a late. So that soundtrack was made for General MIDI, and they're sort of they're retroactively pushing it for an MT-32.
So let's talk about some other soundtracks then. Which other games do you know? Because I actually, beyond the Sierra stuff is really what I know.
What about like early LucasArts? Come on, like the Monkey Island theme.
Of course.
Even before we get into the real extensive use of Monkey Island 2, even the original Monkey Island with like the 5-6 songs that it has, they sound pretty amazing on MT-32, even though I've heard that the composer never liked the device.
I wouldn't be surprised. And from what I understand, so the early games, King's Quest 4, Monkey Island 1, they used the stock patches in the unit. And then later games, guys like Ken Allen and and Mark Siebert and some of the other Sierra guys, they actually went in and created their own patches for
Yes,
all of these
a
games.
lot of those games are like 89 and up are pretty heavy. Most of the LucasArts ones, I think, rely on
using stock.
just use stock mostly. I don't remember seeing, but I could be wrong.
If you listen, so there's a really cool program actually that a librarian software. Again, I have to shout out Brandon Bloom because he hooked me up with the librarian software. But to program the MT-32 right now, I have to use, or I am using, a DOSBox instance of Windows 3.1 and a program called LA Synth Editor, because there's no at least there's no modern solutions that I'm aware of that are compatible with the MT-32 to send back and forth patches and program back and forth patches. The popular one at the time when it came out, as I understand it, was one for the Atari ST. Mm-hmm. And trying to emulate the Atari ST and send real MIDI data to a real MT-32 is, I mean, the DOSBox way is already very clunky, and it's just the way it's got to get done in order to program and use different patches on the MT-32. But once you do that, you get some pretty cool sounds. Like they were able to program with very limited ROM options because they couldn't sample any sounds or anything into it. They were able to program some amazing stuff. So even some of the bird noises that I was talking about earlier.
The Sierra games always had the doors opening and closing.
I think Mark Siebert did a lot of that stuff, but I could be wrong because I see his name.
All those Sierra games
by the patches
are very patch heavy. But like for example, what else? Loom has a classical Tchaikovsky soundtrack redone by George Sanger.
Is it Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake?
It's Swan Lake. Yes, it's all of it is from the Swan Lake, and they're nice transitions to nice sort of adapted for MT-32
well, and
soundtrack.
George Sanger's a guy you got to mention because he really. I don't know how responsible he is for the development of General MIDI, but from what I understand, he's directly responsible for how FM synthesis, in terms of like ad-lib and things like that, he kind of helped to standardize those things. Well, so he said the music, the levels, like the audio levels should be the same throughout these patches, so that or whatever. There was a lot of interesting stuff that he was responsible for.
Yeah, and one of the things he was responsible for is like the helping out on the Origin stuff, right?
That'd be where everybody would know him from, Wing Commander.
But Wing Commander, along with Monkey Island 2, two different companies, they both had sort of adaptive music.
Yes.
In the pre-General MIDI era. Was
Monkey Island 2 the first one to kind of do it?
I don't know,
was it the iMuse system that started it, or was it before that?
I honestly have no idea. When did first Wing Commander come out?
1990 on MS-DOS.
Wow, so Wing Commander was first for sure.
First, yeah, to use adaptive music.
Well, in that form, I'm sure there are examples of earlier. Every time you look up, it's just like every time you can think of something, there's always like at least 5 things they did before that nobody knows.
Well, you know what the interesting thing is, they had, people could do things before, but sometimes the ones you know about, because they just had bigger budgets, and obviously it helps to have a great game. Wing Commander series being kind of a seminal series in, space combat I mean, it must have been mind-blowing in 1990 to play Wing Commander and say, oh my god, the ship's coming right at me, and hearing all the sounds and hearing the music.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, these are kind of things that we kind of take for granted now. We just kind of fuss with DOSBox to get them to work, or we buy them on GOG or something and they just work. But I don't think that was such an easy thing back in the day, especially when you were adding MIDI and MPU 401 hardware. And God, I can only imagine the amount of time it took. I mean, it takes me a long time to work with retro PC stuff now. I can only imagine the time it took back then.
Yeah, it's probably it was probably very time consuming. What else? Hold on, what am I thinking of? Oh yeah, the Ultima 6 has a pretty good, very famous soundtrack that sounds really good on MT-32. Okay. I want to give a special shout out to the terrible DOS version of Double Dragon 3, which is an awful game, but it has an amazing title tune that's just unique to that version of the game. It's not from the arcade, or it's not from any other ports, where I forget who did the MT-32 version, but I know the ad-lib conversion was done by the Vibrants. But the MT-32 version of that song sounds amazing. And generally, like, all big budget games that you can think of supported it. All the way through to the introduction of the general MIDI standard in 91, 92. I mean, games still supported it after the fact, but they started targeting the more popular general MIDI standard that took away, it standardized the instruments amongst other things. Like when you get a thing like an MT-32 or any other MIDI device for a time, things were kind of just whatever. It has 128 instruments.
Well, right. So
weren't really arranged.
You can send general MIDI information to an MT-32 and it'll play back, but it's going to sound weird.
Right.
Because number one, the MT-32, for some bizarre reason, defaults as the first channel to channel 2.
That's right. It's one channel up.
It's really bizarre. And there's a way to reset it. You can send a program change to make the MT-32 go to channel 1. But even if you do that, the sounds aren't the same. Like, let's say sound number 1 is piano, right? On both general MIDI and the MT-32. But as you go on in the sounds, they don't line up at all. Mm-hmm. So you could be having like a synth sound, which is supposed to be a cello. And of course, as general MIDI got better and better, and the sounds got better and better, it didn't matter that they didn't have to change the standard. They could just change the sound.
They can change the sound, and that's why general MIDI is still around, and the sort of exclusive MIDI devices with their own stuff aren't around anymore, because we have a standard to, like, no matter which card you used from like 92 up, if you had a general MIDI card, it didn't matter if you had like a I don't know, a sound blaster with a wave blaster on them, right? Or an O32, or who cares, even like Gravis ultrasound, and stuff. You always knew that the one was piano and like 16 was something
drum
else.
Sounds.
Was there,
channel 10 was drum sounds.
Right, but it was all across all those platforms. So that was the gain, and what has to be given up is that ability to customize your own sounds. So that went away. But general MIDI, of course, the standard also offered a lot more sounds to make up for it. So there's all kinds of like stuff like the telephone ringing and all that stuff that's like at the tail,
sound effects or
like
whatever.
They're all at the end of the things to make up for all those weird stuff.
And they usually sound really bad, but some people have used them as signatures in a way.
Depends on the card. Actually, what one of my favorite is, I was recently playing, because I have an MT-32, and I was playing Police Quest 3, which is past that era. It's right on the cusp of the... Oh no, it's 91, so it's right before the general MIDI, so it's still an MT-32, and it has a really cool patch when you're waiting inside the first floor. It has, and because it's in stereo, you're in the office, and it has those things where in the distance in both channels the phones are ringing, and people are picking them up and talking to them, and it sounds sort of like Peanuts, the adults in Peanuts. It sounds like it sounds but it's just quiet enough and just to the sides where it actually creates on the MIDI device that sort of an immersion thing where it uses it not for music but for atmospheric effects, and it's really, really cool. Tell me more about soundtracks. Something I've been listing a whole bunch of them.
Well, okay, I'll pull one out that I totally forgot about, and unacceptably so, because it's my favorite game of all time. I think, at least my favorite PC RPG for sure, and that's Might and Magic 4.
Oh, yes.
4 is my favorite. A lot of people would name 6 or the Heroes of Might and Magic series is phenomenal, but that's a little bit later. But Might and Magic 4, to me was kind of my favorite. I think graphical setting, the color scheme, I really loved everywhere you traveled, and that game supported MT32 music, and I love the soundtrack. And that was 1992, and it initially was a disc-based game, and then eventually they did a CD-ROM version. But I don't believe the CD-ROM had any kind of
CD music.
Music. Yeah, I don't think it was included in the music. I remember, of course, playing it mostly on my whatever FM clones Radio Shack sound card that I had, which one day I'll probably dig up on eBay or something. But yeah, it was that's if you haven't played that game, first of all, that's an amazing game. I know a lot of people point to 6 or whatever, but that for me 4 and then the combination of 4 and 5, which was unbelievable. You could combine 2 games and become one huge game. I don't even think anything like that's. I mean, sure, some like has been done like that, but to me, it was just awesome. It was almost like a DLC in a way, I guess, or an expansion pack.
Right.
Might and Magic 4 and 5, but there were improvements.
And then you could combine them together if you had both, and
one big game.
And it also like enabled teleports from one side to the other.
That's right.
You could actually.
Well, I remember so as you leave the first town in Might and Magic 4, there's a pyramid there, and it says, if you don't have the other game installed, which I never did, and I never even realized you could do it, the moons have not aligned or something along those lines, and you can't go to the dark side. And I'm like, what the hell is this? Do I have to beat something in the game? And then I bought the next game, and they're like, oh yeah, you can combine. I was like, oh my God, you got to be kidding me. This is amazing. So that game, I love the soundtrack. I love the opening theme, especially. I mean, I can sing all these and hear them in my head, as we speak about it. And listen, New World Computing is probably one of my favorite PC game companies. Not one that gets a lot of love like Sierra or Origin. Everybody wants to collect, or LucasArts. Everybody wants to collect Origin, Sierra, LucasArts. I like to collect New World Computing. Up to the point where they were bought by 3DO. They did make some good games, and then whenever 3DO completely took over, was it Activision? I'm not even too sure. At some point, they just kind of weren't really the games that people initially, kind of remembered playing. Somewhere in the Might and Magic 9, I think it was 9, where it kind of really transitioned to games people didn't want to have too much to do with. Or Heroes of Might and Magic 3 was still probably one of the best games of all time, and then Might and Magic 4 is kind of a bit of a letdown for a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, what else? So we already mentioned Monkey Island 2 as being a very special example of, first of all, just generally a great soundtrack overall. The game has wonderful music like throughout.
I think a lot of people refer to Monkey Island as their favorite of all time too, right?
Yeah. I mean, Monkey Island just generally has really good music.
Yep.
Throughout the series, but Monkey Island 2 is like the one where it's like 4 or 5 composers, like all of the company's composers, like Michael Land, Clint Bajakian, of course Peter McConnell, at least those 3, maybe even more, and they all collaborated on this wonderful soundtrack, and it's adaptive as well.
Right. And is that the first time you see it is when you walk down into the bar?
It's right in the first location, because they're all connected. Because it's all this giant. It's
over the bridge or whatever.
It's as soon as you walk over the bridge, even if you, because it has a little theme that plays atmospheric sound before you even step onto the bridge, before it gets into the Largo theme. Depending on when you step onto it, it sort of switches. Not very gradual. It's pretty fast, but you can still see where it finishes the bit of the last. It jumps to the last bit and then finishes. But that first area is also the biggest demo of that, and also it's like they also said it was so complicated they never did it again. After that, but that whole introductory area is such an amazing demo for.
Well, what do you mean they never did it again?
They never did it again. Well, first of all, after that, shortly after that, they went with the digital audio. It was right soon, and the only other interactive like the iMuse was used in like a Star Wars, TIE Fighter,
X-Wing
TIE Fighter, and Dark Forces. That's pretty much the other 3 uses of that same tech, and after that it's all digital. I mean, like Full Throttle is just digital music.
Yeah, the CD-ROM, by the time you reach the CD-ROM era and Maniac Mansion 2,
I specifically want to... Day of the Tentacle has that, but it's not used to the... It's just used it's just used to transition into the next song, basically, while in like Monkey Island and stuff, like it has one of those where it's like you can go to like 6 different places and they all have their own transitional points and stuff, and it's really cool, and a central theme that connects them all.
Well, it must have been expensive to develop, and again, let's go back to that thing that I mentioned earlier. This is the upside of having this amazing stuff happen is that you get it. The downside is when developers specifically realize the cost, they just can't afford to do it. It just becomes too expensive. Now, of course, adaptive music is the absolute norm in pretty much every single game you play. It's very rare that you don't hear adaptive music. And adaptive just means that it's not linear music. It doesn't start at one point and end at one point. It starts, you have various things like when you're detected, there's kind of a new urgency to the music. And then when you're in combat, there's another style of music that, further intensifies the music that's happening, or various things like that. But pretty much that's the norm, and certainly every AAA game and many smaller games as well, indie games as well.
But I want to give a shout out to a very specific example, which maybe not to everybody's liking, but the Tempest 2000, for the Atari Jaguar, originally had like a techno tracker soundtrack made on an Amiga, I believe. Okay. And every other port of that game had the CD music, had the music sort of not just converted but rearranged slightly, because the original tracker format wasn't particularly clean, so they just took those songs and redid them again for the future ports. But the DOS port of that is very unique because it came out in '96, and it has the version of that soundtrack rearranged for ad-lib, weirdly, not even OPL3, like a straight OPL2, renditions of that techno soundtrack, which is really weird. And it also has an MT-32 option where it's just custom patches.
Wow.
It's just giant thing where, like, if you load it up, the screen constantly says loading, because it actually sends, it sort of treats it as a tracker. It just constantly sends in sysx messages.
Wow. See, that's something that you could really achieve some amazing stuff with.
And it sounds like techno music. MIDI is not particularly fit for like sort of like short burst, for what dense techno music is, especially not in the 90s. Because the sounds that sort of those MIDI synthesizers did, they have that specific sort of feel to them, right? They feel, you'd think electronic music would feel good electronic, but all of those things are like, it's piano, it's drums, it's not exactly what like what we know like in the 90s dance music, but Tempest 2000 actually kind of succeeds in sort of like approximating those techno tunes.
That's one I gotta try.
On the MIDI synthesizer. Somebody actually recently, I posted the ad-lib version a long time ago, but I couldn't get. That's one of those things that didn't emulate too well in Munt. But finally somebody got tired of waiting, and I think last year, or maybe the year before, they put up the MT-32 version on YouTube, and I mean, it's really silly because it's just 90s dance, but it's cool to. That's not a soundtrack. That's unlike any other soundtrack you will hear from an MT-32. It's a very very unique thing. But another thing we should talk about is we've talked about some of the drawbacks with space and cost and everything, but we also have to mention the compatibility between the things, because there are two revisions of the sort of original MT-32, right? Two of them just have different chips, but they're the same chip. They're just different form. That's in the 80s, and that's the original one that we talked about, the ones that had 40 millisecond sys delays and everything. But those are the games of the 80s. That's what they expect. But later on, the whole different model of MT-32 was made shortly after, which was slightly less noisy, but also had a different CPU. Like this thing is essentially a computer, and that one didn't need a delay, but also some of the Sierra games, not just Sierra games, but some of the games not only use custom patches, but also sort of exploit some of the bugs in the original model for their own purposes. And none of those bugs were fixed in the later versions. So the music that those 80s devices target doesn't work completely properly on the newer model. And
unreal. So you need to buy two MT-32s to be a proper retro gamer.
And the games that are made like in the 90s that expect a newer model, like the Sierra games, if you just plug them in directly, like all those sysx messages, like the screen and everything, they all come up with checksum error because they don't wait for 40 milliseconds. Stuff. You need to get a different driver or program to slow down the sysx export and stuff. So even between those two, in just a short few years, those models have differences, and different games expect different things. As always with everything on PC, nothing is ever perfect, and everything just goes to hell with different configurations.
Well, that's the blessing and the curse of being an open platform, right?
Yes,
so
absolutely.
That's why there's always hardware conflicts and this and that, and people are looking for compatibility. And that's why, I think that's why Apple eventually gained a lot of popularity, because it's just a plug in and go. Now, are they more expensive for lesser hardware? Always. I mean, they always, for as long as I can remember, they are. You pay more for lesser hardware, but it's going to be compatible because that's the only
right. It's a standard configuration. Yep.
Yeah, there's only a handful of configurations, and they're all using the same stuff. So
another thing that happened is Sierra apparently approached Roland, even in the 80s, into trying to convince them to also add create a different device with an actual DAC and a buffer for digital sounds, and they refused.
Wild.
But at the same time, I guess the MT-32 was selling rather well because Roland created a separate line of computer music devices called the CM to follow up the MT-32, and like CM32L sort of became the next incarnation of that series of devices. It was essentially an MT-32 compatible with additional 32 sound effects, but it was, you could, like the games that supported the 32L directly would play those effects, but you could also just play MT-32 games on it. It would completely match up all the instruments and everything, and you could still upload the patches and everything. But you still needed all those other devices, and eventually Roland released the LAPCI, which was an ISA card with everything combined. You didn't need another card, you didn't need an MPU for one anymore. You could just buy one thing with everything on it, and it was essentially a CM32L and everything.
That's amazing.
And all combined for the low price of $425.
And I bet you now in today's money, that's probably, I don't know if you'd find one for cheaper than that.
Yeah, now, again, it was towards the end. It was introduced in '89, and as we know, just in a couple of years later, General Media took over, and those cards kind of became obsolete.
Yeah, I don't even see those cards now, sadly, for sale, because that would be totally cool to have everything on just one ISA card.
Yeah, and it was like a big, long card too, because they had combined three pretty big devices into one.
Cram all these chips onto
it's like the size of like an early CGA card. It's a full case long card. So make sure you have the room left. But so I'd say let's discuss some of its mythical status, because of its cost and because of the quality of the sound for the time and everything. MT-32 even to this day gets brought up as like the best thing ever for retro sound of that era, even by people who never had or heard one. It just acquired that reputation, and as both of us own one and both of us are familiar with that device, and I would like to say the device, as good as it was and as cool as it is to own one, is a bit overrated.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of drawbacks to it. The upside is the quality of sound that it gave you from that period, 1987 to what, 1991, 92, whenever the
Yeah,
SC, the sound
on
canvas or
that
whatever.
platform is unmatched essentially.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, well, you had other things, but when did the Gravis ultrasound come out? And I know for a fact
it's like 92 and up, 93.
right, so it's much later, and that was not a very widely supported card
No,
like the
no.
MT-32 was supported. And I think even far fewer people had the Gravis ultrasound card. I certainly don't know about it. Or even the later cards that had the ability to put on the daughter board that kind of improved the sound, but I think that stuff for the most part was later as well. You know, like the AWE 32. I'm not even sure what year that was. 94, much later. And then, you know, so the interesting thing is too, there's a lot of emulation options on different devices. Like they say they offer
I have one. I
MT-32
have a
compatibility.
Sound Blaster Value, but all it so it's I mean it's works for some games because all it does is remaps. It takes the
The MIDI
MT-32 the input and it just remaps it to whatever the general MIDI matching instruments
equivalent.
are.
But the problem is if you have any custom programming, you're
it
toast.
doesn't work. So it's cool.
You're
It's all right if you play Monkey Island or Loom,
the
but
first
if you
3-4 games.
but if you play any like the extensive Sierra games, they will sound way off.
Yeah,
Way off.
and I have I have a really odd unit that initially I don't even remember why I bought it. I think I just bought it because it looked cool and it was going to make general MIDI sounds, but it offers 2 MT-32 compatibility modes, excuse me. It's called the Yamaha CBX T3. I had to stand up to look at it because I didn't even remember the model of it. And it sounds decent for general MIDI. Like I could see doing a soundtrack on it. The only problem is I think as a consumer of any kind of modern retro product like a game or whatever, or soundtrack, I would actually want to hear something that I knew. So I would want to hear an MT-32, for example, or I'd want to hear a sound canvas, or maybe one of the Yamaha units from later, the MU series, you know, because those to me have nostalgia. Like, you know, is somebody going to compose music for AW32, AW64? That would be kind of cool. But they start to sound more similar, I think, as time went on. The difference being the digital to audio and conversion, and then maybe the effects that were supported, and you know the general MIDI standard kind of like we said, it standardized the sounds, but it you couldn't program it like very distinctively like you could with an MT-32 because they weren't really, they were synthesizers still, but they weren't really offering you the ability to change.
Right, they weren't as
the samples
flexible
on the fly. You couldn't remap the sounds.
And that's why it was the end of custom MIDI in PC. Basically, it was just became general MIDI, which at that point became a fight for who has the better quality instruments, like who can fit more memory on their card to have a bank that sounds better. And that was the fight for a while until, you know, it just went all digital music, so it all just went away.
But really the cool thing about, I think the coolest pieces as a composer for the MT-32 is it's like really a synth.
Yes,
it's
a real thing because it was never meant as like a gaming thing or whatever. It's just meant it was meant to be like a prosumer thing, and that's its main advantage. It's also its main disadvantage because you had to jump for all those hoops to get it hooked up, and
it's a huge disadvantage because a lot of keyboards back in the day, they were compatible with their like lesser module versions. So if you had the keyboard and the module, you could basically just double the amount of sound polyphony you could get. or patch layering you could do some amazing stuff with. But with an MT-32, if you owned a D50, let's say, and an MT-32, you weren't able to access extra capabilities without sending system exclusive messages.
And
back
also,
and
let's be honest, if you had a D50, why would you need an
MT-32?
MT-32?
No, you weren't. You wouldn't. And
Exactly.
and it's funny, if you're gonna really laugh. Do you know what year was the Roland D50 introduced?
I'm gonna say 83.
87. So it was the same year.
Really?
Yep, 1987. So here's the price difference, right? So $695 for the MT-32, $1895 in the US for the Roland D50.
On launch?
On launch.
That sounds awfully cheap. I mean, it's a lot of money, but I expected over $2,000.
Yeah, I think I expected over that too, and it was also a much better synth,
and also that's a synth that's
much more powerful synth.
We also I always like to mention, because like once I got the MT-32, I was like, wow, the output is really, really noisy. You wouldn't listen to it in the studio. But having said that, I've recently been listening to a lot of 80s records and stuff, and a lot of them are noisy as hell on the instruments. Like some of them are so noisy.
The D50 is noisy, and the reason I know so much about the D50 is because I tour with an artist named Sean Paul, right? Jamaican dancehall artist. There's 2 keyboard players in the band. One is me. Another is a guy named Nigel Staff. Nigel Staff, if you know anything about dancehall music, he's kind of the living legend musician of dancehall. Now, he's not like an artist, singer, or whatever like that, but he backed essentially every dancehall artist that ever has come out of Jamaica at one point. Started way back with Shabba Ranks and Beanie Man and all these guys, and now Sean Paul, of course. But he still, to this day, plays 2 Roland D50s on stage. So each of us play 4. Well, I play 5 keyboards on stage, and he plays 4. He plays 2 D50s and 2 Korg M1s, and the M1 is, I think, was supposed to be basically a competitor to the D50 a couple of years later, and that has plenty of signature sounds in it. But the D50 he still uses, and to this day he's still got great patches that all the dancehall artists still love, because they've sounded as good as they sounded on stage since he started using them. And I hear it all the time. There's some signature patches on the D50 that I just love.
Oh yeah.
And there's, interestingly enough, on the MT-32, I have this librarian software, and I have I guess it's the Sierra library, because it's thousands of sounds that I can load in anything from the Sierra library, and I don't know exactly how it was compiled. I think it's
Quest Studios ripped.
Quest Studios, right?
Yeah, like they ripped all of the patches, and there's a ton of them. You can just download them in one big archive.
It's a couple of thousand.
Yes.
Like if you didn't have any other synth option, you could make soundtrack after soundtrack after soundtrack with just that unit in the librarian. Would you want to now, given what's possible with, I could do crazy music on my iPhone probably easier than I can program an MT-32. No, but it's just amazing to get all those sounds. It's like, it's just unbelievable. And then we should really speak about Munt, which is the emulator of the MT-32. But before we go Munt, one last word on the D50. The reason I brought it up in the first place, my engineers and my front of house engineer and our tour manager will complain about those D50s till the day Nigel changes, which will be never. They will complain and complain that, oh, they're noisy, man. They're always giving, and literally there's always problems with them, because we don't always carry our own equipment. And even when we do carry our own equipment, because these keyboards are so old, they need repair. Like when you play on stage, and especially with the group that we work with, we're doing a lot of outdoor shows. So we're exposed to elements, all kinds of elements that are wreaking all kinds of havoc on these units that are 30 years old. And we're expecting them to work like it's still 1987 and still get parts for these things to repair them. And so it becomes an issue. But even those things at $1,895 were still very noisy. I'm not sure what DAC they had, if the same DAC chip was in the MT-32. I doubt it. I think the MT-32 was a lot cheaper.
Yeah.
But yeah, the D50, the D50 is really the daddy, the big daddy of the MT-32. So if you really want to hear kind of the full potential of it, the D50 is what you got to listen to. Huge in reggae, huge in
everything. You listen to any 80s movie synthesizer soundtrack or any 80s like dance song. There's a D50 on everything. Oh God, just for anybody who's really interested, go on YouTube, type in D50 stock sound demo, and just like there'll be plenty of videos of people just going through all the default presets and playing a few notes, and you'll recognize so many of them from so many songs of your youth. So yeah, it's worth checking out.
I love it. I love the patches.
But let's talk about Munt. So Munt is pretty much the only emulator for MT-32 that's worth it. You can.
Are there other? I wasn't even aware that there were other projects.
There were others. I mean, Munt itself grew out of another project, which by now is obsolete. But there were others. But I think at this point, Munt is the only one that's worth it because that's the one that everybody backed. So MT-32 was hard to emulate because of how it synthesizes the sounds, right? So it wasn't particularly accurate.
Right,
in
the
how it functioned
was part of the sound.
Yes, so
the D50 had that same issue.
Yeah. Right, so but now it's very, very close and you don't get any of the noise. However, I would like to point out that now that I own an MT-32, part of the charm is how noisy it is, how imperfect it is, how you have to shut it on and off every time you want to use it just because you want to reset it because God forbid one of the settings stayed and your next game is completely messed
hanging
up.
Notes and things like that.
Yes, and everything. Yeah, so if you don't want to spend any money, Munt is your number one go-to. Now that I've mentioned the money, I would also like to say that if you are spending money and you're buying an MT-32 today, you can save yourself some trouble because you don't need any of that additional stuff. Because it's a MIDI device, you can plug it into your modern machine with like a USB to MIDI adapter, and I have one of those. I have a Roland one.
Yes, but here they're very problematic. So if you don't buy a Roland one,
the ones that are knockoff,
not a lot of guarantees.
Allegedly might not work well. I have a Roland one, so
I have
fun.
the M Audio MIDI Sport Uno, I think, and I've used that for years on all kinds of keyboards and computers, and they work fine. On the MT-100, I was using an MT-100 before I got the MT-32, and it was giving me all sorts of issues.
Yeah, I have a UM1 as well, and it works just fine. And you can just point Windows or whatever your OS is to that MIDI output, and you can play the game on DOSBox. And DOSBox actually handles, even if you have a old MT-32, it will handle the C6 delay for you as well. The ScumVM will do that as well. You don't have to worry about any of that. So you'll just need to buy the unit. They're pretty pricey. Depending if you you can wait for one pop up on eBay for cheap and try to snipe it, or if you wanted to don't shell out too much money, because let's not drive all the prices up. But
what did we see the last unit go for with the
don't
the MP401?
That was like almost $500, right?
Wow.
Yeah, but because it had all the bundles in it. Don't do that,
Unbelievable.
people, because you don't need the but if you want to use it on a retro machine, here's the thing. Because they were made for MPU 401 interfaces, a lot of cards have external MIDI outputs through the game port, right? All the Sound Blaster compatible ones. They do not output in intelligent mode, which is what MT-32 needs for the sysx commands. That can now, so before it was a problem, but now that's not a problem anymore. There's this program called SoftMPU that you just run, and it turns as long as you have a MIDI out that's that works in DOS of your Sound Blaster compatible card, it will make it work. It will rearrange it to work in an intelligent mode, and you don't need any other devices. So whatever sound card you have in, it will work with that. There are also clone cards, clone MPU 401 cards that you can buy that. So they're just MIDI intelligent mode and the Sound Blaster dumb mode. It's not officially known as a dumb mode, but it's like an intelligent mode and a dumb mode. So they work
inside joke.
They both work in that mode, and you don't have to buy an MPU for one unit. They have a MIDI out on them. I actually have one of those cards now, and so it will work.
And does it work well?
It works really, really well. It works the same as it's an ISA card. It even works on my IBM PS2 Model 30 that has an 8086 in it.
Wow.
And I can play MIDI music just fine through that.
What games do you get to run up?
Well, I mean, it runs like Civilization, Prince of Persia.
Wow, okay.
Somewhat okay. So to the point
So
where you
run
can
the Sierra games and
play.
stuff.
It will run Sierra games, although that machine doesn't have EGA support. So on the EGA games, it will only work on ones that detect that the PS2 and switch to the 16 color VGA mode instead, which a lot of them do, but some of them don't. Or you just need an updated driver for them, and it will work. But also there's all kinds of things that like I have this thing from MicroProse where just a collection of MT-32 music. You just press a different key and it plays a different tune or a sound effect, and that will work and stuff. So those cards work. They're kind of pricey, but they're cool. And if you have now they don't delay the sysx messages for the older MT-32, but again you can run soft MPU with a parameter, and it will do it for you.
That's cool.
So that's another way of doing it.
Saves you a lot of headaches.
There's also a hardware version of soft MPU, which is called hard MPU, which is essentially
Clever.
Which is not a direct clone of an MPU 401, but a different implementation of the same thing, and that will delay sysx for you in hardware. And there are also clones of whatever the MPC interface as well. You can, because it's really hard to find an old one online. So you can, if you have an MPU 401 somehow, and or like a later version of the MPU interface, and an MT-32, but don't have the card for the PC, you can buy a clone card for about $50, and that will put them all together. And of course, there's an option of buying everything. Like we said, the recent complete package that we saw went for almost $500 just last week.
Yeah, I should have bought it when I got that offer.
Yeah, if you knew, if in my country we have a saying, if you knew where to fall, and so on. But whatever. So it can be pricey, but and it's a pain to use, as we've mentioned multiple times over.
Yeah.
But it's cool to have an actual retro device. The ones that are in good shape sound what they sounded like. It's a nice.
Well, let's point out the important distinction that you'll need if you do buy an MT-32. It really boils down to, there's more than two revisions, but the two revision differences that you'll notice is the old version does not have the headphone jack. The new version has the headphone jack. The headphone jack is not located on the front and is not an 1/8 of an inch. It's on the back. It's a 1/4 inch.
Mm-hmm.
So you're still going to need either a headphone adapter.
Oh, that's right, because it has the what are they called?
Unbalanced
audio out.
Unbalanced 1/4 inch outputs. Mm-hmm. So you're going to need some kind of mixer device or interface with inputs, which most of the retro guys are not going to have.
Yeah, that's true.
Those things. These are things I had for years, not thinking about retro gaming, is just thinking about the music.
I have a mixer just for retro gaming specifically.
Right. And well, a lot of people are buying them, now. I mean, when did you buy that? You didn't buy that recently, did you?
Well,
5 years ago, 6 years ago.
A few years, like when I started capturing soundtracks from, not from emulation. No, just a few years ago.
Okay. So the other ideal thing, though, is if you did have, it's got the line out for your speakers, one, and if you were using, say, like a MIDI stack, like you have the Sound Canvas SE55 or the SE55 Mark II or the SE88 or the 8850, whatever, any of those sound canvases, and the MT-32, and for some stupid reason you have a CM32L as well, or any other device, a Yamaha MU series, or even the Korg. There's some really cool Korg units that probably aren't so retro gaming popular. They're more popular for musicians, but they would also work. They're all general MIDI. You can plug, depending on how many inputs your mixer has, you can plug all of them in at the same time and kind of turn them on and turn them off as you need them. And I think Lazy Game Reviews, Clint has a pretty weird, cool video on, you know, his ridiculous MIDI stack. One thing that let's briefly mention this. One thing that's very confusing to people is that the MIDI in and the MIDI out, when you're connecting to your computer, they have to be opposite. So you're sending the MIDI in of your computer to the MIDI out of a Roland MT-32. You're sending the MIDI in of the Roland MT-32 to your computer MIDI out, which is really bizarre. But it makes sense when you think about it in terms of signal.
Well, yeah, one port accepts it, one outputs it. So
right, but I remember, you know, oh, you just match this up, and then eventually the interfaces, especially the USB ones, got smart and it said two MIDI in, two MIDI out.
Yeah, they're
so
like
just match them up. They're like, you're dumb, just match it up.
But that's what you have to worry about if you get the real unit. But like I said, Munt in a sense is even better, kind of. And it got accurate enough to actually accurately emulate the things. And even if you can enable a little thing that will pop up a little, because you know they have no LCD screen, you know, but it will pop up a little window.
It does. It has a fake LCD
that
screen.
Will tell you what's on the LCD screen, so you'll see that insert Buckazoid thing or something. Well, I think I've said just about everything I wanted to say. Do you have anything about an MT-32 that you wanted to add that we missed?
Did we miss? We probably missed a whole bunch.
Yeah, we'll probably remember like tomorrow. Like why didn't we talk about 10 other things?
No, but if I can, I'll just quickly plug the Crimson Diamond again, because I think it's let's just talk about the game. It's modeled very similar to you'll be reminded of A Colonel's Bequest, the Laura Bow game, the first Laura Bow game, but it's not that game. It's definitely its own game, and I've been getting some inside information about the upcoming chapters that are in the game, and they're ridiculous. I couldn't believe it when I heard what is going to happen. You know, if you play the demo, you may have one impression of how the game's going to go, but man, it's going to unfold, and it's a much larger game than the demo, which is available for free on Steam. You could go to thecrimsondiamond.com, and you can also just look it up on Steam. The Crimson Diamond is the demo is available for free. It has, I believe, my soundtrack stuff is in there already. The main theme is in there, and there's a dinner theme in the dinner scene, but a lot of that's going to change. They're not quite final versions of the music yet. They're probably pretty close. The average listener might not be able to tell when the final release is out versus these earlier demos of the game, but they're pretty close to what the final versions are going to be. There may be some added sections that weren't in there. We may change the timing of things to match up better with the game sequencing, and then also try as much as we can to do adaptive / iMuse style music with the game. So I think it's going to be really cool. I think any MT-32 and retro PC music enthusiast is going to love it. And then also the people who actually just loved playing Sierra games, even if they had to use the PC speaker. So you won't have to use the PC speaker for this one. There won't be any of that noise, and it'll be a lot simpler. Just a couple of clicks on Steam and you're good to go. It is set for release this year. We don't have an exact release date, but we're hoping well before the end of 2020, you'll see a full version finished of the game, and that would be very exciting.
Nice. Sounds excellent.
Nice.
Alrighty, sir. Well, if people are looking for you or your stuff online, where can they check you out?
Oh, I'm really well hidden at the moment. You can Google my name, Dan Policar. I'm on Instagram, Dan Policar. That's my probably the most active social media that I'm on at the moment, but that is going to change. I'm working on my own podcast right now, which will be all music related, but probably not so much emphasis on retro gaming. And that I can't quite announce yet because it's still a little bit of a top secret, but it's coming soon. It's going to be a music-based podcast. And yeah, you can also, if you're on any country that you're in that has a Sean Paul concert, it's a very good chance you'll see me there on the stage if you go to the concert. And that could be practically anywhere on the planet. At this point, we've been to 60 countries since I've started working with him. Sadly, not. I haven't been to Russia, sadly, but hopefully at some point soon we will go there. And then I should also announce that I've been working on another video game soundtrack called Empire of Sin. And that is nothing to do with MT-32 music at all. That is, if you know anything about that game, it is a turn-based strategy game / SimCity sim building type game set in 1920s Prohibition era Chicago. And the coolest part about that game is the fact that it's going to have similarities to some of my favorite games like XCOM, the Jagged Alliance series, and is made by none other than Romero Games, which includes Brenda Romero and John Romero. You may know those people. They are probably... John is probably about as legendary figure as you can get in the PC gaming world, and Brenda is right up there, very close. Yeah. I mean, I cannot thank the two of them enough for, especially Brenda, for giving me a ton of direction and mentorship in just the game industry in general. And although it has nothing to do with the MT-32, you will hear some of my music in that game, and that is supposed to be coming out in the spring of this year.
Oh wow, already! I'm looking forward to that game because I'm a big Jagged Alliance 2 fan.
Oh really?
And
there you go.
And I like that style of the game, the flexibility, and Brenda had a lot to do with that game being as good as it was.
She is no joke, and she's a wonderful person, and their family is wonderful, and I'm like, over the moon about that. That actually really gave me my start in game music, and it was Brenda who made that happen, And
nice.
It's helpful for her to be the CEO of the game company so she can make these decisions. But yeah, I mean, they're fantastic people, and this game I think is going to be top notch. And it'll be very different from anything that's going to be released, I think, in the whole year. I don't think too many games are focusing on Prohibition era Chicago anyway. So the soundtrack is going to be very different from what you'd hear. It's not going to sound like, the average Skyrim soundtrack, or
right.
It's going to have a very period correct soundtrack, and it's going to be really, really awesome.
Awesome. That sounds great. And people can find me, if they don't know, while they listen to this podcast, I can be found on Twitter at DasNostalgic, on YouTube, on whatever you can use the search engine of your choice to look for Das Nostalgia. You can find me and get in touch with me if you have a topic that you think you can discuss for about an hour or two, a DOS gaming related topic. Let me know, and you too can be a guest on Das Nostalgia podcast. Well, sir, thank you very much.
Oh, where can they find both of us at the same time?
Both of us at the same time in the same room probably can be found at Long Island Retro Gaming Expo. Is that what you were hinting at? I don't know.
I was hinting at that, yes. Okay. I don't want them coming over to my house or anything.
Yeah, stay away from my place too. Keep your hands away from my MT-32. But yes.
Please come to the expo. We'll be there. We'll be talking. We'll be displaying a ton of stuff, as much as we can get our hands on and we can get help for. And that's a project we're also actively looking for knowledgeable volunteers to help with that.
And you can tell us to our face what we've gotten wrong in this podcast.
It's plenty. I remember last year somebody really going at me and saying, "Oh, that's false." I said, "Okay."
Yeah. So instead of leaving all those YouTube comments, come and tell it to our face while you
come and give us real life YouTube comments.
And we'll beat the shit out of you, and then you can play something like there's playable Space War at the place. I mean, it doesn't really get much cooler than that, but it does. So
we're building a replica of the original Pong as well.
All this crazy stuff. There's some
amazing stuff.
Not only you get to see with your eyes, but you also get to touch and play and talk about with other people. It's all very interactable. There's plenty of stuff to do for both days. Come, bring your families. It's a family friendly event. There's enough to do for the kids. And yes, I
had a good exhausting time last year.
Me too.
I know you were exhausted.
Yes.
I nearly ran you into the ground, literally.
I am generally exhausted. It's okay. But yes, so this is it. Thank you, sir, for joining me on this podcast. I had a lot of fun.
My pleasure, man. Thank you for asking me.
I hope people had fun listening, and I hope we meet again on another episode of Das Nostalgia Podcast. Goodbye.